Great. Well, welcome everyone to our webinar this evening. We're here to talk about international development. My name is Nanako Tamaru, and I am the Executive Director of the Boston Network for International Development, which we call BNID for short. And we host this program through what we call aid in higher ed, so advancing international development in higher education. And we have 4 partner universities, which you all are from, so Brandeis University, Bridgewater State, MIT, and Worcester Polytechnic. And this is part of our program to help students like yourself get to know more about the international development sector and about what career possibilities are in this sector. And we've got a lot of great stuff to cover today, as well as a wonderful guest speaker. I'm so excited that she could join us today. But before we dive into the material on careers in international development, I want to talk a little bit about BNID, because I think that many of you here today could benefit from the programs that we're putting on and may want to know more about them. So we are really the hub for international development in the greater Boston area. You could even say within New England. So within our network, we have about 50 international development organizations. A lot of those are INGOs like Oxfam, Partners in Health. And we also work with students like yourselves and the universities that you attend. And our goal is to really build that network, strengthen those connections, help students like you get your foot in the door in starting your careers and building those careers, as well as helping INGOs find other potential employees, as well as kind of building and strengthening those connections, creating space for collaborative learning and reflection so that we can do our jobs better and have more impact and support communities in a more meaningful and to promote better partnerships. So that's really what we're here for and what we do. So I said a little bit about our aid in higher ed program, which is part of this webinar, but I want to bring to your attention a couple things. So we hold a bunch of events each academic year for students, and this is the first one. In just a couple weeks, I'm going to put it into the chat. We are hosting an in-person networking session, which is really an opportunity for students like yourselves to meet with folks that are working in international development. We've got people coming from Build Health International, Oxfam, the Mariundo Initiative, so folks coming from the education sector, public health, engineering, infrastructure, and it's your opportunity to grow your own network, to ask questions. How did you get into this field? Like, do you have any career advice? Might be helpful if you're looking for internships or jobs as ways to connect with people doing the work so that you can get to know them and they can get to know you in case you decide to apply for jobs or internships in the future. So that's coming up on October 10th, and I would love to see you guys there. I just put in the chat the link to the registration page. Bring all your friends and your classmates. It's open to all. It's free. And again, it'll be, I think, from 5:30 to 7. There will be food and drink and just an opportunity, again, to get to know professionals living in Boston doing work in international development. And we'll also have another career panel on November 12th that will be kind of like this, a little bit more. Today is more of a webinar. That one, the career panel, will be more interactive, but that will be on November 12th via Zoom, and we'll be sending out more information on who those panelists will be. So that's just a couple of things to put on your radar, but please, I hope to see you all in Cambridge in a couple of weeks in person. The other thing I want to let you guys know about is our individual membership. So we just started this program last semester, and that is an individual membership. So we've got about 40 INGOs or organizations, nonprofits that are members, and we have and some of the logos you can see on the screen here, and we have actually that number is outdated now. We have about 20 individual members as well. And what we do for our members is we hold member-only webinars, workshops, and discussions to really support professional development, career advancement, and again, that stronger relationship building across professionals and organizations. And so it's $50 a year for students, and we really are looking for folks who have experience in the sector, who are able to contribute to these conversations. And so we do only limit it to graduate students. So if you're an undergrad, you can still come to our career events and things like that. But this program is really to build those connections among folks who are doing the work or have done the work. And so it's just, you get kind of ready access to some of the webinars and workshops we have coming up include a webinar on fundraising, something on monitoring and evaluation, as well as on inclusion and equity. We also have a meetup, which is a social kind of networking event for folks that are working in sub-Saharan Africa. So that's just something, again, something else to check out. I'll put that link in the chat as well, in case, oops, that didn't copy in right. In case you're interested in looking into BNID membership. Again, it's $50 a year, and you get unlimited access to all of our member events, and also discounted tickets to our public networking event, which I should have a slide for. I just realized I don't. We have a public networking event on November 10th, and that's open to everyone. We don't have the registration up yet, but just mark your calendars. Again, it's a great way to meet other people who are passionate about international affairs, folks who are working in this space, folks who may have done Peace Corps and don't work in this space anymore, but really are interested in it. So it's just an opportunity for the broader community to get together of like-minded folks who are passionate about international affairs and international development. So those are just a few ways to be able to stay in touch and get to know BNID a little bit better. But I do want to jump into what we're here to talk about today, which is, what is this thing? I keep talking about international development, but what is this thing called international development? And for some of you, this might be something maybe you've already done work in this sector. Maybe for some of you, this is brand new. So we're starting kind of at the beginning to start just answering the question, what is international development? I know that when I was an undergrad, I didn't even know international development existed. I think by the time I got to grad school, I kind of knew it existed, but didn't know kind of the wealth of opportunities and the breadth of opportunities out there within this sector. So I wish I could have had this webinar for myself back in the day. So this is just, again, an opportunity for you all to learn about what is this thing called international development, and what does it look like to work in this space. So let's dive in. I find the best way to frame international development is to rely on what's called the Sustainable Development Goals, sometimes called SDGs. And these goals were developed and adopted through the United Nations and have been kind of accepted by all member states. They all signed on in 2015. It's like almost 15 years ago, no, 10 years ago, I can do math. And it's part of the 2030 agenda. And the goal was that we were going to advance towards all 17 of these goals, before 2030. And I think we've made progress, although there's plenty of progress to go. As you look at these 17 goals, you might notice that it covers a lot of different sectors, right? There are some that are very people-centered. Things like, number 1, poverty. 2, which is around hunger and food. 3 is around health and well-being. 4 is education, right? They're very people-centered. I think these first few goals are ones that really come to mind immediately when you think of international development. But then as you keep looking at the rest of the goals, you might notice that it kind of gets broader and broader, right? There's also things about how we relate to one another, thinking about social justice, reducing inequality, reducing conflict and violence, right? There's also environmental factors, right? Protecting the environment around us, the planet, the oceans, forests, and animals, and also things like infrastructure, technology, energy, and urban planning, and then, of course, governance. So as you look at this, you might think, wow, international development kind of touches on almost everything, you might say. And it does. That's kind of the amazing thing about working in the sector, is that there is pretty much a job for every person interested in working internationally to support communities in need in all different kinds of sectors. And within this, I'm going to switch to another way to think about it, and some other terms you may have heard of, is there are 3 kind of, I would call them sectors within international development, sometimes called international aid more broadly. And that's sustainable development, which is international development, humanitarian response, and peace building. And you might notice that it's a Venn diagram. So there's overlap between each of these sectors. And even in the middle here, this is not a very good diagram because there should be more of an overlap in the middle. There is even a center where all 3 overlap. And so as we think about kind of what type of work, sorry, let's go back. So the SDGs give you kind of breadth of types of things like education, working on equity, working on peace, working on infrastructure, right? These are topics. Another way of thinking about kind of how the work is done is through these three sectors. So development is often thought of as reducing poverty, inequality to improve health, education, and job opportunities around the world. So development is often considered kind of more longer term, right? We're looking at a longer term scale. We're not going to achieve development overnight. We're not going to have education for all and zero poverty, next month. It's not quite that quick. It's a longer term investment. It takes time to set up systems and to work with communities to find the best solutions, the long-term solutions, right? So this is international or development often takes longer. It's a longer-term response. You might compare that to something like humanitarian response, which is very much short-term, right? This is really targeted towards saving lives and relieving suffering in emergency situations. That could be emergency situations due to natural disaster, whether that's floods or hurricanes or droughts. Droughts, I guess, a little bit longer term, or emergency situations like conflict, like violence. So folks that are forced out of their homes because their city or village was attacked. So that's providing people with food, water, medical attention, sometimes shelter. So it's really meeting those immediate needs. So when we think about humanitarian response, that is emergency response happening in the immediate term and providing for people's immediate needs. You can see then kind of how this Venn diagram overlaps is that while there might be a short-term humanitarian response, we also have to look at the longer term. So if people are forced from their homes because of a flood, are they going to be able to return? Or do they need longer term, relocation or support to rebuild their houses, right? And so there's an overlap between the humanitarian and development work. And then we have peace building, which is the sector that I have worked in for over a decade and probably know the best. So if you have any questions about peace building, happy to answer them. And here it really is as it sounds. It's about building peace. So it's seeking to transform the relationships, culture, and institutions to prevent, end, and transform conflicts. So this, again, can be both immediate and longer term. So in the immediate phase, it's about stopping violence. It could be getting a ceasefire together, be able to create humanitarian corridors so that folks can bring in that food and other aid that's needed. Peace building is also a longer term exercise. So it's about understanding what are those root causes of conflict and how do we address them. And again, you see that overlap between peace building and sustainable development because sometimes those root causes are related to development. So perhaps in some places it could be that violence is happening because of political repression or where certain groups aren't allowed to vote or have no say in decision making, which kind of overlaps with sustainable development. How can we create better government systems that allow more people to have a say? And it also, as I said, overlaps with humanitarian response, often with those kind of that immediate need. We need to have the violence stop, if not for just a little bit, to be able to get that needed humanitarian aid to the people in need. So this is just another way to think about the breadth of the international aid sector and the different types of work that you can do. And we have a guest speaker who I'll call on a little bit later, but Hasi has worked both in humanitarian response, sustainable development, and maybe even peace building. So she can talk about kind of how all the how her work in these different sectors kind of has overlapped and what that has looked like. So actually, before I move on, the thing I want to kind of emphasize here is that international development is primarily about doing good. If you look at kind of these three sectors, if you look at those SDG, Sustainable Development Goals, it's really about helping people in need, right? It's about stopping violence, preventing harm. It's about people who need immediate medical attention and making sure they get it, right? It's at its heart, it is about doing good and helping others. But as you explore this area as a career, as a potential area of work, it's also important to be aware of some of the systemic issues and power dynamics that are that we're trying to change and shift in our sector. So I provide this graphic, and I will admit that this map is outdated. I think it's probably about 10 years old at this point, but I think it shows a good illustration of how money flows and also how power flows. So this is a map, this is a global map. The countries that are listed in blue are often what's referred to as the global north. You can see many of the countries are on the northern side of the map, not all, but many. And then many of the countries in red and orange are considered the global south. And when you look at this map, the blue is countries that are giving out development assistance aid, so giving out money. And the orange and red are the ones that are receiving the money. And so just by looking at this map, you know, the numbers are going to be outdated because this is about 10 years old, but it gives you a sense of how things are going, that money is flowing from the global north into the global south for development. On the face of it, that sounds great. I'm glad that countries in the global north that are well-resourced and are able to share their wealth with countries in the global south to help things like humanitarian response, development, and peace building. But as you scratch below the surface, there's more complexity there. So the money that flows from global north countries to global south countries often comes with conditions, or countries in the global north will say, well, we'll only fund human rights programs, or we'll only fund education for girls, right? That the donors are setting parameters on what they're willing to fund, and then the recipient countries can only use the money for those specific purposes. So in that way, the global north is kind of setting the agenda for how and where they think that the money should be spent. And this has been going on for decades. I mean, international development kind of emerged post-World War II. And so we've seen this kind of process of donors setting the agenda, deciding the priorities, and then kind of giving the money, but with strings attached. And so it's important to understand those power dynamics that are happening. So that's on a kind of global and kind of political scale. There are whole classes taught on that. So in addition to thinking about kind of the global stage, it's also important to reflect on yourself, the individual, and why you want to work in the sector. As I said, everyone that works in the sector, we all want to do good. We are here to help others, but there is something called the white savior complex. And I have some resources and readings and videos that I'll share in the chat in a minute. But the white savior complex is this notion that we, often Americans, Europeans, people coming from the global north, feel like we can and need to save others. And this, yes, comes from a sense of altruism, but also out of elitism, as if we know better and can do better for communities in need. And sometimes some of the examples that you see, if you look up white savior complex, some of the examples, there have been documentaries on this and papers and books written on this, and some of the examples are quite blatant. But I find that as I have worked in the sector for many years, oftentimes it's more subtle, that we don't realize kind of the implicit bias that we have, or the implicit racism that's so embedded in how we think and how we do, that it really requires us to take a step back and say, why am I doing this work? And am I actually helping the communities that I'm working with? And am I being a good partner? Am I letting them take the lead and decide, not letting them take the lead, they should take the lead. Our communities taking the lead and setting the agenda, not just me coming in from the United States and coming into whatever country and saying, this is what I think you should do. Right. So instead of doing that and coming from a place of kind of elitism and I know better because I'm an American, coming from a place of curiosity and coming from a place of partnership, and really being willing to take a step back and not be the expert in the room, but be that meaningful partner. I'll actually put into the chat a great video. This is a TED talk that I think really gets at when it's really subtle. This is a woman, Chisti. She works in foreign aid in Afghanistan, and she talks about how she knows all of this in the back of her head, but as she's doing the work, she realizes that she herself has some implicit biases that she didn't realize were at play while she was working with women in Afghanistan. So it's all to say, all of this is set up to say that there is a rising movement called Decolonizing Aid or Shifting Power, which essentially looks at both of these trends, right? The trend of the global north giving funds to the global south with conditions, or saying this is how you need to spend the money, as well as many folks coming from the global north going into the global south and saying, this is how you should do it because I know better. So decolonizing aid or shifting power is really about seeking to relocating decision-making power from donors, from folks in the global north to the communities themselves. So what does this look like in practice? So instead of coming in and saying, you can use this money to build a school in this place right here, and this is how you're going to build that school, instead of a donor coming in and saying that, a donor comes in and says, community members, what do you think, what is your most pressing need, and how can we help you address that need or those needs? It's about practitioners like myself coming in, not coming in and saying, I am the expert, I have built 100 schools, and so I know the best way to build a school, or I know the best way to fulfill this need, is instead coming in with, again, that curiosity and partnership and saying, communities, you lead the way, and I'm here to support you. You tell me what would be most helpful. Do you need me to do fundraising and get more funds here? Can I provide some technical expertise if that's helpful? So it's really about taking that step back and not being kind of front and center and allowing communities to lead the way. And this might sound totally basic. You might be like, wow, seriously? Like this is what we're striving for? But it is, and it's something to be aware of. I think it's so important for all of you as students and folks that are coming into the sector to be aware of, and important we need people like you to be advocating for this change, and continuing to do the work both individually and organizationally, to make sure that we are shifting power to the communities that are in need, that are on the receiving side of aid. So that's just, again, something to keep in mind as you want to do this work. I think it's important to come in with your eyes open and understand what you're walking into. I am going to put some more resources. Thank you so much, Hasi, to put that resource there in the chat. I've got a bunch of a few links here, which is more on decolonizing aid. Oh, it looks like two of the links got jammed together. So let me, and for those of you that are joining on the recording, I will also have these links ready so you can access them as well. But this is just more resources that you can read about decolonizing aid and shifting power, what we mean by that, and what we're hoping to see within the sector. And it's something that both Hasi and I are working towards. And Hasi, if you have time to talk about that a little bit more. So we talked a little bit about the what is international development. Let's talk about who works in this space called international development. Most of the time, the first place that comes to your mind is the UN, the United Nations. And the United Nations is many things, right? You have the UN General Assembly, which is actually meeting this week in New York, but there's also like the UN Development Program, UN Women, UN Habitat, the World Food Program. Like the UN has so many different arms of work that it's doing in international development. And is really well known, but there are also a ton of organizations, nonprofits, that are doing this work as well. This is just a few of them. There are like thousands, maybe even tens of thousands of organizations doing work. Many of the biggest ones are based in the global north, and they work internationally across many regions and countries. Other organizations are really small and might be based, in the country in which they work, and are run by folks from that community as well. So it really ranges the size and scope. But I'm going to give you a couple examples of organizations that are based here in the Boston area. So if any of these strike an interest to you, these are organizations that you could readily meet either through a BNID event or just through connections here in the Boston area. So Partners in Health is one of those really big nonprofit organizations based here in Boston, but works globally. They work in 11 countries, and they are primarily focused on public health. So they do a range of work on, you can see on the screen there, it lists kind of the types of public health issues they work on: cancer and chronic diseases, child health, emergency response. And they do work in different ways. So they're focusing on making sure that staff is trained, that people know the best practices, also have access have access to the resources and materials that they need in order to provide the best medical care. I think what's interesting about the Partner in Health model, they also have social support. So they're also not just providing medical care, but they're also providing food, shelter, transportation, right? They realize that a person is not just about their medical needs, not just the body, but there are other aspects of that whole health that they're trying to address. They also work on systems, so leadership, governance, information, and financing. So they do advocacy, both at the US level as well as international level around public health issues and public health financing. And they also work to make sure that there are appropriate spaces for practitioners to be able to provide that medical care. So that's just one example of an organization. And okay, so they're working specifically in public health, which is related to the SDG goals of people's well-being. So that's one that might immediately come to mind. Another one is Build Health International. They're also based in Boston. And how I said that some of the SDGs are things that you'd immediately think of, like public health, like poverty, like hunger. Build Health International, they work in public health, but on the infrastructure side. So they're mostly engineers, architects, and others who are working on building building the buildings, right? On creating the space needed, bringing that technology as well as other resources that medical practitioners need in order to do their jobs well. And so they're really focused again on the infrastructure side of public health. So there's like the actual side of doctors and nurses meeting with their patients, but also making sure that they have appropriate buildings that have, I'm not a doctor, but, you need specific rooms for surgery or resources for doctors' offices and other things so that they can provide those services. So it's really more about the infrastructure side. Then you have organizations like the Institute for Justice and Democracy in Haiti. They are a human rights organization, and they primarily work with lawyers in Haiti who are working to promote access to justice and democracy, making sure that the laws are being upheld and that human rights abuses are being accounted for, or people are being held accountable for human rights abuses. So they do a lot of trainings with lawyers and judges, especially women looking to build their skills. And so this is more, it's less about provision of food or water or shelter, right? It's about human rights. So working more on that legal space, the legal accountabilities and human rights space towards, I can't remember which goal it is, I should know this, I think it's SDG 16 or 15. And then we have Conflict Dynamics International, which is an organization that I've worked for. If you have any questions, happy to answer them. But Conflict Dynamics is a peace-building organization. Well, they work in peace-building and humanitarian response. And so they're a peace-building organization, and a lot of the work that they do is focused on government. So if you think about, right now they work in Sudan, and if you think about, the violence that is happening in Sudan, it was in the news today, what type of governance system can help to sustain peace in Sudan in the long term? Is it a presidential system, a parliamentary system? What kind of electoral system might best sustain peace in the long run? So they're really looking at like the government, like how is the government structured? How are people elected, right? These really kind of governance oriented things. So again, just giving you some examples of the many different pathways that exist within international development, whether we're talking about, I gave examples of public health, human rights, and peace building, and government in particular, but there are also other organizations in the Boston area doing education, right? Working with youth. We've got other organizations that are focused on job training and helping people to have improved livelihoods. We have organizations working towards alleviating poverty. We've got so many different types of work that are out there. And a lot of organizations working on climate change, right? Climate adaptation and climate mitigation. So there's just many different avenues. As we think about what international development is, it's a lot of things. And there are many different career paths within it, as you can imagine. So this is a great time to turn to our guest speaker today. Her name, Oh, here we go. There we go. Her name is Hasangani Edema, Hasi for short, and she's a program manager at CDA Collaborative Learning. And I've invited her here to talk about her own career, the type of work that she's done, which has spanned many different sectors, to again give you guys a sense of what do careers in this space look like. Like, if you work in this space, what are you actually doing day to day? So I'll hand it over to Hasi and let you take it away.
Wow, thank you so much, Nanako. I wish when I was studying, there was something like this because it would have really helped. But yeah, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really honored to have the opportunity to share my experiences and perspectives on a career in international development and humanitarian work. A journey that has deeply shaped my worldview and commitment to decolonial practices on a daily basis. Um, so, as a young professional from the global south, I hail from Sri Lanka. So, I've had the privilege of working across a broad spectrum of organizations that dominate the international development sector, from the UN to large INGOs, and now to a research organization. And that too, my experience spans in the Middle East, in South Asia, over the last 9 years. And navigating this terrain as a non-Western female identifying humanitarian has not been easy. I started out as a peacebuilding volunteer with the UN volunteers in Sri Lanka, and then working within the UN system as a program associate for UNESCO, and was quickly exposed to the dysfunctions of the system. This field is largely dominated by voices and mindsets and power structures from the global north, by donors, international NGOs, researchers, who sometimes lacks like meaningful engagement with local realities. But through this journey, I've also witnessed incredible resilience, innovation, and leadership of communities on the front lines of crisis situations and conflict. One of the most rewarding aspects of this work has been to champion the inclusive, community-driven approaches in humanitarian response and recovery and resilience programming, especially with my work with World Vision. I worked as a program officer with World Vision, where I was mostly involved in designing programs and liaising with donors for business development and fundraising. And then also leaning into a little bit of program management as well. So rather than imposing predetermined solutions in the designs, I've always tried to center the lived experiences, ancestral knowledge, and then the self-determined priorities of the communities I've worked with. So to give you a bit of an example of the initiatives and the programs, I've also tried to bridge this conflict and post-conflict needs within the intersection of like humanitarian, peace building, development, what Nanako was referring to earlier. So some of the programs in Sri Lanka and in Iraq looked like mental health outreach for war widows, developing community-led disaster response programs that kind of reached and spanned thousands of people's needs post a disaster like a flood or a drought. And then I specifically worked with Syrian refugees and displaced Iraqi folks who were kind of afflicted by ISIS, to address their needs holistically. With CDA, I've had the honor of accompanying local partners in their own processes of transformation to locally led leadership through a program we call Stopping at Success. I will put the link in the chat later. You can have access to it, and we have ways of providing feedback on our tools and things like that. So really invite you to have a look at that. But it's basically referring to the how of shifting power. And then I've also worked on facilitating systems levels analysis to enhance risk management in humanitarian contexts through another program called the Risk3. So really interesting and important research that contributes to the effectiveness of aid, as we call it. And CDA, well, for me, CDA was the right place because it worked at the heart of the HDP nexus. So it really resonated with my lived experiences and the change I wanted to see and work towards. Of course, none of this has been without challenges, as I mentioned earlier. Navigating this complex, ever-changing, changes constant landscapes of post-conflict and protracted crisis, while also balancing donor requirements and addressing systemic inequalities is really difficult, but it's and sometimes also I've really felt the weight of colonial legacies bearing down as well, undermining efforts to actually foster true and equitable partnerships too. But in these moments is where, like in these moments are when I've truly realized the future of the field really depends on our ability to think systematically and to imagine alternative pathways and to center the leadership of communities and center healing and restorative justice in our work, in this kind of work. So I have like 6 points that I kind of summarized that might be, that can be advice or can be reflective to you all as you kind of seek careers in this field of work. One is to lean into your lived experience, stay connected to your roots, as it can offer invaluable insights and unique vantage points to your the sector lacks. And the second one is developing cultural intelligence about power dynamics, political economy. It will help make your work more authentic. Think systematically, develop foresight for long-term strategy, and learn how to analyze complex problems and interconnectedness between different systems. And the fourth one, prioritizing continuous learning. You have to do this in this sector because, like I said, it's constantly changing. Prioritizing learning participatory non-extractive decolonial research methods is really important too. So you co-create solutions. And sometimes, because sometimes you don't have the answer and you don't need to have the answer because it needs to come from those at the receiving end of the work that we do. And then build your resilience. Humanitarian work is emotionally and physically taxing. So self-care is a priority, and knowing when to seek support is key to staying committed to this work. And lastly, don't be afraid of setbacks and failures. That's really important, especially those of us with marginalized identities. Obstacles and failures are inevitable, and they provide valuable learning opportunities. So, and this work isn't for everyone. This work isn't just a job, it's a way of life. And despite the challenges, it brings a lot of joy. It brings a lot of joy, especially when you witness and speak to people who've benefited from the work that you do behind a desk or wherever, because it's centered in healing and restorative social justice. So it's impossible to go back to something, whatever you were doing before. And so to me, this sector, like working in this sector, is all about harnessing the interconnectedness of these 3 sectors that, Nanako was talking about before, and really unleashing the transformative power and potential of the sector. Yeah. with that, I'll pause and hand it back to Nanako. I don't know if there's any reflections or questions. Yeah, but thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Hasi. Well, let's save questions for the end, but this is a plant for as I gonna cover a couple more things, start thinking about any questions that you might have for Hasi or myself. There'll definitely be time at the end to answer a few questions. I also just put into the chat Hasi's e-card. So cool. I never even knew e-cards were a thing. So you can find out how to get in touch with her through the e-card. But Hasi, you touch on so many great things. I'm just going to go back to a couple of these slides. This is the diagram that Hasi mentioned a couple times, right? That her work has been kind of done humanitarian response, development, peace building. There should be a little overlap in here, which was that HDP, humanitarian development, peace building, nexus. That's what that little part in the middle is called. And so I feel like Hasi, just as you described your work, really shows kind of how folks, you might not just work as a humanitarian for all of your, some people do, some people stay within one sector your whole career, but it sounds like you've kind of jumped around different parts of different sectors or done work kind of in these overlapping parts of the Venn diagram. I also, one of the things that you mentioned was research. So as we talked about kind of these SDGs, right, we talked about partners in health. They're definitely, they're providing service, they're providing medical services. The Institute for Justice and Democracy in Haiti, they are doing human rights work, but there's also research, right? On all of these topics, there's also things like research and advocacy. So you're not actually the person, it's SDG goal number 4, quality education. You may not be the teacher at the front of the room or the administrator, in the school, but maybe you're out doing advocacy at the government level or to the UN about the importance of inclusive education or importance of education, multilingual education, right? Or maybe you're doing research on, how does it impact students who get to learn in their own native language? What does that do for children in the long run, right? So there's not only kind of the service and frontline delivery toward achieving these goals, but there's also things like advocacy and research and other things that are also, again, more potential career paths within this sector. The last thing I will say, and Hasi kind of alluded to this as well, is that there are many different ways that you can get into this work. I think Hasi, it sounds like you had a lot of kind of opportunities to do the work before you went to grad school. I really didn't start in international development until I really got to grad school and then started my career from there. But so for many folks, we just know international development's in our blood. This is something we'd like to do. And so we dive right in. Other folks, you might, there could be folks in the room, maybe you're an engineer, or maybe you're pre-med or pre-law. I have friends who they were a lawyer for 20 years, worked in the US, did litigation or other types of law, and then said, you know what, international development has always been my passion. I want to switch gears. And so now they're taking their own career, their lessons learned from what they've done as an attorney for 20 years here in the US and going abroad and working with lawyers in other places. So there are ways in which you can either dive into this sector and do the work from the get-go, or you might go down a different path, do some work in the US or other places, and then decide to jump into a career that's more international based. So there are many ways to get into it. And I really encourage you, if you're interested in learning more about career advice and how to get jobs, make sure to attend the next career panel, which is on November 12th. And again, information will be sent out by email. And we'll have another career panel as well in the spring semester where we'll really get down to, how to prep your resume, what kind of experiences you should be looking for, and things like that. But some general advice that I can share from my own experience. Some of the same things that Hasi literally just said. One of them is stay up to date on current events. So make sure you're reading the news or listening to the news, whatever medium you like to do, but that you're staying up on what's happening in the world. Strengthen your cultural competence. If you can, travel abroad. And if you're not able to travel abroad, I realize that can be expensive, or perhaps because of visa issues, you can't leave the country. There are also ways to engage with refugee and immigrant communities here in the United States and your own local community. Take classes and experiences that broaden your global perspectives. So that's really important. If you are not currently an international development or international affairs major, you're going to want to make sure that you're taking classes on different international things. So you just get to know more about what's happening in other parts of the world, get to know the history, colonial history, or other different types of indigenous history. Anthropology is a really great way to learn that. Just again, to increase that cultural competence. And then prioritize work and volunteer experiences. I will tell you, as a person who does a lot of hiring, I don't really look at what classes you've taken. Classes are great, classes help you learn. But what I really want to see is like, what skills have you received from volunteer or work experiences that will help inform the work that you're going to do for me? So classes are great, but work and volunteer experiences are even better. So again, that doesn't mean you need to travel abroad. Some people can do that, but it's not for everyone. Maybe you can look at ways to volunteer or do an internship with organizations based here in Boston that are working globally. Maybe you can find ways to volunteer with refugee resettlement. There's a lot of refugee resettlement programs here in the greater Boston area. So there are many ways you can build that experience and build your cultural competencies outside of the classroom. And I encourage you all to explore those. So that's really, a couple other things just to share that might be useful resources. One is, this is a working list of INGOs. I didn't even say what INGO stands for. INGO is International Non-Governmental Association, essentially a nonprofit that works internationally. This is a working list of INGOs that are in the greater Boston area. You might be shocked to learn there are over 200 of them. This is a list that BNID we've collected and are continually building and updating, but might be helpful if you think about looking for jobs and volunteer experiences while you're in school. And that is really it for us in terms of content. I'll say, there are many ways to stay in touch. If you're intrigued by anything that we talked about here, we will be having more events as part of this aid and higher ed program. Again, I mentioned we have the in-person networking event happening on October 10th, where you get to meet with professionals who are there to answer all of your questions, big and small. You could also consider becoming a student member as a way to be able to drive more professional development and career advancement if you've already had work in this sector. Or if anything, to sign up for our newsletter. It's a great way to stay in tune about what jobs and opportunities are in the greater Boston area, as well as what other events at other universities or other institutions are putting on. Again, everything related to international development. So I'll pause there, and I want to be able to allow for any questions for Hasi or myself. It can be anything related to careers or anything that you've heard today. And please feel free, you can put them in the chat, or you can just unmute yourself and join in. Hasi, I have a question for you while folks are thinking about their questions. Yeah. It sounds like you've done you've had so many different types of work experiences throughout your career. Like, how did you see that coming? Did you know that you kind of had a lot of different interests, or was that something that kind of came about organically?
I think it came about organically because of the context, of Sri Lanka, because we had a conflict that lasted for almost 30-40 years. And so from childhood, we were exposed to INGOs working and all that. And then we also had really huge natural disasters. And so the tsunami, and then we constantly had climate impacts. Starting from a very long time, we noticed that our climate was changing as a country. And so a lot of that really exposed me to have different experiences. And the unit that I was working for was called HEA, or Humanitarian Emergency Affairs, but our work spanned between development, peace building, and we recognized that without creating trust in the community, we couldn't really do our work. And so that's how, like, we did peace building work, we did social cohesion work, we did, yeah, it was the context that really exposed me to doing a lot of the work. But yeah.
Yeah, thanks. I think that makes a lot of sense. As you said, like, I wish someone had given me this presentation when I was in grad school, because I did not realize the breadth of opportunities. And as I've gone through my career, I've been like, oh, that's interesting, or oh, that really aligns with my passion and experience. Like, I myself have switched from kind of career path to career path as I learn more about what's out there. So yeah, I hear that. We had one question from Francis in the chat asking if an organization or individual not located in Boston can become a member of BNID. The answer is yes, and membership is open to anyone. But I will say that because we are the Boston Network for International Development, that all of our events are either based, the in-person events are based in Boston, typically Cambridge, Boston kind of general area, Waltham. And then events, and they're all based in the Boston time zone. So even events that are held virtually are often held at the lunch hour. We often do lunch hour webinars or evening sessions as well, but they're kind of in the Boston time zone. So it's up to folks if they feel like they can make that work, where they're based, if they can make that work. But yes, membership is open to all. Are there any other questions or thoughts before we close? Great. Well, thank you. Just want to say thank you, Hasi, so much for joining us today. I just really appreciated you sharing your own experience and the breadth and depth of work that you've done in many of the different sectors. And for all of you, please do keep in touch. We will be reaching out about future events related to, again, career advice, career panels that are coming up, and always open to hearing suggestions from you. If there are panelists you'd like to see or particular presentations that are of interest, please do let us know. And we'll be in touch over email about future events. And for everyone joining through the recording, I hope you enjoyed, and please do keep in touch. So thank you all and have a wonderful evening.